And welcome back to another episode. In this video, we're going to go over the idea of cognitive dissonance from Scott Adams' book, When Bigly. Now, if you remember from the previous video, we talked about the persuasion filter, which is a subset of the moist robot filter, which states that people are irrational 90% of the time. We are constantly making irrational decisions and justifying them later. Now, if you were to ask most people, they would say they're rational 90% of the time and irrational 10%. But the persuasion filter says no, it's exactly the reverse. And cognitive dissonance is one of the biggest sources of this 90% irrationality. Now, a good working definition for cognitive dissonance is that it is mental stress or discomfort experienced by an individual who holds two or more contradictory beliefs, performs an action contradictory to their beliefs or values, or is confronted by new information that conflicts with existing beliefs, ideas, or values. Essentially, our brain, as it can never truly understand reality, is always relying on our senses, is constantly dealing with contradictory information. It therefore generates illusions in order to deal with this. And cognitive dissonance is very easy to spot in others, but it's very hard to spot in yourself. And that's a very important point. You need to understand that although everybody else around you is 90% irrational, so are you. I'm irrational, you're irrational. It's just the way it is. So, how can you spot cognitive dissonance? One of the major tells is just how absurd the rationalization is the person makes to justify it. So, for example, you may have a person who has a self-image of being smart and healthy. Yet this person smokes, which is obviously not smart or healthy. So how does their brain justify this? Well, they might make an absurd rationalization that he heard about a guy who smoked and lived to be 100. Now, obviously, this is kind of nuts. I mean, that is just one person. It goes against all common sense, goes against all evidence. But if you're suffering from cognitive dissonance, that trigger can provoke that kind of response to justify it. And that's one of the key points, too, is to kind of separate cognitive dissonance from just being routinely irrational. Cognitive dissonance usually has one very specific trigger that causes it. So there's a single event or trigger that causes the mental conflict. And the 2016 election was the biggest trigger for cognitive dissonance in our lifetime. It was literally worldwide, but no more so than what you might call the professional political class in the United States. And these basically includes all the talking heads on all the networks that you see, people who are writing articles, people who basically have spent their lives in one form or another studying politics. Now, as soon as Trump came on the scene, almost universally these people mocked Trump, questioned his intelligence, his talent, and constantly stated that he had no chance of winning. But then we had that trigger, which was Trump won. And that's what caused this mass cognitive dissonance crisis. Like, how do you rectify that? If you're a political pundit and you consider yourself smarter than the average bear, and you say Trump has no chance of winning, and he's been saying that from the beginning, and yet he does, how do you square that circle? And most of them are still having a very tough time, because you have to admit that you're wrong about polls, swing states, Trump's intelligence, his tweets, the importance of ground game, and the down ticket to Republicans. People who are anti-Trump, sometimes almost viciously so, would have to admit that they were wrong about everything, and that they're not nearly as smart as they thought they were. And this has been the major reason that the whole Trump or whole Russian collusion thing is still a thing. I mean, it's being investigated for I don't know how many months now. How many reporters have looked into it, and yet they're still trying, and yet they found nothing. I mean, there's no crime that's been committed that I'm aware of, and yet they still keep looking because they have to find some reason to square the circle of Trump being elected and them still having a good pulse on the nation and them still being smart. Another example, this one is from CNN, is the constant hindsight, what I call constant hindsight is 2020 articles, where they try and explain why they were wrong. But what this shows is that their brains are attempting to handle the cognitive dissonance, and their brains are generating multiple illusions to do so. And Scott points out this persuasion tip that don't trust a filter that isn't able to predict. So, again, with these articles, the one thing they should be looking at is that their original assumptions, their original filter, was just wrong. So now they're trying to come up with all these other reasons, but if those reasons were true, they should have been able to potentially predict Trump's election victory. And so they're still very much struggling with it. Now, more tells for cognitive dissonance, especially online, where things can get particularly crazy. And what you typically get is a mocking word or acronym plus an absurd absolute. And this happens in comment sections and particularly on Twitter. So let's say you make a solid argument for gun ownership, and that's going to trigger the person you're communicating with, because they have to square the circle that they think it's a bad idea, yet you've made a good argument. So, for example, they might say, laugh out loud, I guess you want to give guns to babies. So laugh out loud, the acronym or mocking word, and then the absurd absolute. That, of course, you didn't make that argument, but in order to kind of push you away or to justify their cognitive dissonance, that's what people will say. Another one, which is similar, is you might hear a mocking word or acronym followed by a personal insult that is more aggressive than the situation seems to warrant. And I got this myself on net neutrality. Earlier I made a video arguing against net neutrality, saying that I've looked into it and I don't think it's as big a deal, or I think it's actually negative. But the few people who I talked to, one of them said like, oh, well, I'm a fascist that doesn't want the poor to access the internet. And that's just nuts. Like, no, I was arguing that people who use the pipes, like Netflix, maybe should pay a little bit more because they're causing the need for the networks to be upgraded. And that video is on my channel if you want to look at it, and if you want to call me a fascist. Another sign of cognitive dissonance online is people will retreat to analogy. Now, analogy has its purpose, particularly when explaining a new concept to a person. So you use something familiar to explain something that is unfamiliar to a person. So for example, with my dad, the first time I was kind of showing him how Windows on a computer work, I used the analogy of it's like papers on your desk. So if you put a paper on top of another paper, the paper underneath is still there. And that kind of helped him understand. But ultimately, though, an analogy is not an argument. When you have facts and reason, you don't use analogies. So if you have a plumber explaining what needs to be done, he doesn't use an analogy. He has the facts, he has the argument, and he just says, hey, this pipe is rusty, it needs to be replaced. So if you're in a discussion with someone and they try and win an argument by using an analogy, you know you've already won. Another way is the attack the messenger. And again, this is just rife on the internet, where they don't deal with your points, they insult you. And how Scott looks at it, which I thought was kind of funny, it's equivalent in a movie of throwing the gun at the monster. You fired all your bullets, you've given all your facts and arguments, they've had no effect because perhaps they're not that good, and then you just throw the gun at the monster. Finally, the final tell for cognitive dissonance is called the psychiatrist delusion, where people try and undermine you or attack you by discerning your inner thoughts and motivations, which obviously you just can't do. And that pretty much covers cognitive dissonance, and which again is one of the major sources of irrationality in people. In the next video we're going to look at is its kind of companion to this, which is confirmation bias. But what do you think of cognitive dissonance? I'm kind of curious, can you think of any examples recently? There's actually been quite a few in the news, or perhaps some from your own life. Can you think of any examples? If you do, please leave them in the comments. And other than that, just want to thank you for watching this video. Again, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, and until next time.